Hello and welcome to Car Pros. Today we're going to show you how to change the front brake pads and rotor on a 1995 to 2004 non-4-wheel drive Toyota Tacoma. First, remove the tire. Next, we're going to disconnect the brake line that connects into the caliper. With that out of the way, we can now remove the two brake bolt slides that hold the caliper onto the whole mounting system. Next, we can remove the caliper and the brake pads along with it. Since we're replacing the rotor as well, go ahead and remove the mounting bracketry for the caliper by removing those two bolts. Next, we're going to remove the axle cap by getting a hammer and chisel, but only tapping ever so lightly. You don't want to damage it. Next, we're going to wipe off the axle grease to gain access to the cotter pin. Next, remove the cotter pin. Next, remove the crown piece that holds the cotter pin. Next, remove the axle nut. It's not on very tight. Next, by just using your palm, hit the rotor, and the outer bearing should pop right out. Next, we're going to replace the axle nut for just a moment. Just grab the rotor and yank on it a few times. The inner bearing will ram against the axle nut, freeing it. Just make sure you pull straight off, and you should be okay. Next, remove the axle nut and inner bearing. Then wipe off the excess axle grease. Next, we're going to disassemble the rotor assembly by removing those 5 bolts. Next, compare your new rotor to your old one, and be sure they are identical. Next, we're going to clean out as much grease as possible in the rotor assembly. Before you put on the new rotor, make sure the contact surfaces are also clean, and then put on the new rotor and reinstall those bolts we removed earlier. Here's a quick shot of all the pieces we removed earlier. Each one of these needs to be cleaned very thoroughly. Once all the pieces are clean, we can now reinstall the grease we removed earlier. You're going to grab one of these bearing pieces and use your palm as a sort of scoop inside the gaps of each bearing piece. Next, we're going to re-lube the places where we removed grease earlier, and then reinstall the bearings as well. On the inner bearing, you're going to need to get a piece of metal, lay it completely flat on top, and hammer lightly and evenly to reinstall the bearing. Next, we're going to clean off the rotor surface. Do not get any carb spray inside of the bearing though. You're only cleaning off the rotor surface. Again, reinstall grease into the place you removed earlier, and then install the outer bearing. Be sure to keep your thumb on it though, because without that, the bearing will fall off. Next, reinstall the rotor assembly, being sure to keeping your thumb on the outer bearing. Then reinstall the washer we removed earlier. Again, keeping your thumb on it, you wouldn't want to fall off. Then reinstall the axle nut, and then the crown piece. Next, and this part's a bit tricky, you're going to hold the axle nut while spinning the rotor to the left direction. You'll know it's on tight when the rotor stops turning when you're spinning it here. You wouldn't want this on very tight. Next, reinstall the crown cotter holder piece and the cotter pin we removed earlier. Next, we're going to reinstall the axle cap. Install it, and then hammer on very lightly. You don't want to bend the metal. You can even spin the rotor while hammering for even pressure. Give the rotor surface a final clean. Next, we're going to reinstall the caliper holder piece by replacing those two bolts. Next, we're going to focus on the brake pads. Remove your new brake pads and compare them to the old ones to be sure they're identical. Next, we're going to put the new pads onto the rotor assembly, and then we're going to go back and focus on the caliper. Next, we're going to grab one of the old pads and use it as a sort of buffer between the large channel locks and the caliper, and then squeeze it in order to recess the piston back into the caliper housing. Next, reinstall the caliper. Next, we're going to grab the gear grease and lube up the bolt slides. And then reinstall your bolt slides to hold the caliper in place. Next, we're going to reinstall the brake line. Don't forget that washer we removed earlier, and make sure it's on nice and snug. It doesn't need to be on super tight though. Next, we're going to remove the cap that is on the bleeder valve. Next, with someone else in the car, have them depress the brakes while you loosen the bleeder valve. Have the valve come flowing out, and while the person's still depressing the brakes, and then tighten it. This will ensure there's no air on this end of the system. And then reinstall the end cap we removed earlier. And then we're going to add brake fluid until we're above the bin line in the brake reservoir. Next, we're going to climb into the cab and depress the brakes fully to the floor very slowly, and then let them come up very slowly. Do this until you have a very firm pedal. you for watching. If you have any questions, please visit our website, twocarpros.com.